My name is Lady Ceridwen Verch Deykin. I will be your basic embroidery instructor today. We'll just kind of go over the equipment that you would need to follow along if you want to. You're absolutely not required to. You can do really any size hoop at this point. This one's kind of like dinner plate size or slightly smaller. This one is definitely smaller than that. And for now, I'm just using a basic piece of cotton. As you see, it's kind of see-through. It's not going to be anything overly extravagant at this point because we're just learning. Everybody starts somewhere, right? And to help with viewing capabilities, I've got a couple pieces of black and a couple pieces of gold. And I will be showing examples of slightly completed works throughout as we learn the stitches. I also have, if I can figure out how my camera is set up, if you can see that, let me find something here. The eye of that particular needle is elongated, which is not normal to if you're doing like hand stitching for putting garb together. This is going to be best for helping with embroidery. Sometimes upholstery needles work really well too, depending on how thick you want your string to be on your embroidery piece. As I go through the stitches, I will open up for questions if you have any after each stitch that we learn. But first, we're going to go through the process of putting your fabric onto your hoop. So I like using this one because of the gripping capability. I know that Duchess Lynn had shared a video on Atenveldt's site about how you can make your hoops do better with holding onto your fabric by putting ribbon or any sort of other fabric wrapped around the inner and outer part of your hoop. I just like it on the inner part. So once you take your hoop apart, you'll lay the fabric onto the inner section of the hoop, and you'll lay it and push it down. Once you tighten it up, which most, if you have a hoop and you're following along, you'll just tighten it up with your little screw doggy here. And as you can see, it's kind of loose. I can push on it pretty well, but you want it to be taut. So usually, some people are a little different. I will pull on the edges, around the edges, and just pull until I can get kind of a drum top going on. Because once it's taut, it's a little easier to get those stitches, get the needle and the stitches put together onto the fabric. I don't know if you can hear that. Sounds kind of like a little drum. Little soft drum. So once you get it a good tautness, because you want it to sound like a drum, you don't want it so tight that you can't get a little bounce from it, but you don't want it so loose that it pushes with your needle when you put your needle through with the fabric. So for those following along, I'm just using a simple DMC thread. Typically these come in the little bundles and they have 6 strands. As you can see, I can pull apart each strand from the large clump. For a lot of these stitches, we're just going to use 2 strands. And you just want to pull them apart here. And what I tend to do is I hold the piece that I'm going to use and the extra, and I'll just slide my finger down. Only because if you just try pulling it, it'll become a tangled mess, especially if you're using a longer piece than the 12-ish inches I have here. And it'll especially become a mess if you end up using something like silk thread, or if you use anything that is not just general cotton thread. Um, it can become a pain, like that shiny DMC. I know there's a lot of shiny DMC thread out there. Once you get your needle threaded, a lot of time if you hand stitch your clothing, a lot of people will put knots at the end, but with embroidery, you don't want to really put knots at the end of it, because it'll end up, when you attach the piece, if you're appliquing it onto something, it'll end up having bulges, and you don't want those bulges showing through on your embroidery pieces. You want the stitches to shine on those pieces. So usually, depending on the length that I'm using, in this case, the 12 inches that I have here, I'll do about half of the string pulled through and leave the length there for the stitches themselves. Does anybody have questions so far? I'm not sure how we can indicate questions or not. I'm using my phone, so this is a little bit more difficult. Okay, so we'll go ahead and move along because it doesn't seem like anybody has a question so far. So the first stitch that we're going to be going over here is going to be the basic running stitch. And the basic running stitch is going to end up looking like a bunch of dashes across your piece. To help you with that, if you have a pencil or a fabric marker, anything that you can erase later, or even darker chalk. For me, I use a blue chalk typically if I'm going to do any hand drawing of patterns onto my embroidery. You'll want to try and just give yourself a nice straight line to follow as you're doing your running stitch or double running stitch in this particular situation, just so that we have something to kind of follow along with how these stitches work. I'll give everybody that's following along a moment. Let's see how many people. You can see I just did a quick little straight line. Mine's in blue chalk. Okay. So then the next piece for doing a running stitch, for those that are unaware, we'll start from the back here. You can see my line faintly, at least I can. And what I'll do is I'll just stick the needle through. When I pull it through, I'm not going to pull it through all the way. I'm going to give it a little bit of a tail. And I usually use this opportunity to hold the tail down with my finger to kind of hold it in place, so that as I'm doing the stitches, it doesn't escape the fabric. And now that I have the thread through the fabric here, I'm going to start off with just about a 1/4 inch long line. And for those of you that are slightly familiar with how embroidery works, sometimes you just want to, and this is why I use the see-through to make it easier to see. Sometimes you just want to kind of guide your needle about a 1/4 inch away from that ended point of that first stitch. Bring it up, and then go another 1/4 of an inch. Now you don't have to fill this entire line. This is just, your line was just to get you started. For me, I'm going to go ahead and do 4 running stitches so that everybody can kind of see what they look like. And if they're not exactly the same length, that's fine. It's not the end of the world. You can always undo it if you really want to make it super equal, or you can just go with the flow, because just like anything else in art, it's not perfect. So this will be, no, this will be your running stitch.
how do you anchor the tail from the backside?
So usually what I'll do is I'll hold it down until I get enough stitches into the fabric. And then after you get usually a second stitch in, it doesn't pull. So you don't want to pull so hard because you're not putting pieces of fabric together. You're decorating fabric at this point. So you don't have to pull it super taut. You just want to pull it just enough. And I don't know if you can see, you want to pull it just enough so that it's almost like it's just sitting on top of the fabric. So once you've gotten a couple stitches in, the anchor should be able to do it on its own.
Okay.
So usually when I get to a certain point in my stitches, I let go because it's a lot easier to move around the fabric without having to continuously hold a piece down. And once you feel comfortable with that, the nice thing about this stitch is it can go right into what they call the double running. And as it sounds, it's basically the same exact thing, except you will be going back over the openings. And as you can see on the back, the front looks like the back, except it's 3 on the back, 4 on the front, because I wanted to put 4 stitches down on the front, and you'll have 3 on the back. Once, I'll give everybody a second here. Is everybody feeling comfortable with the single running stitch? So with the double running stitch, you're going to basically go back on your previous stitches. And what I mean is going back is, this is the back of it. This is the back of the hoop. Remember, the front had the 4 and the back has the 3. To go back, you're going to, from this point, stick your needle back into the recent stitch. And what that should look like on the front is your needle is coming out the end of your last stitch, or the beginning of your last stitch. So now on the back there, you see how it's become a longer solid line. And on the front, you'll now go ahead and put the needle through the beginning of your next stitch down. And so this is the point where I'll show you that you don't have to pull so tight. And you'll do the same thing you did before with guiding your needle. But you don't have to pull so tight. I don't pull super tight. I pull until I start feeling a resistance, and then I let it go. I just let it sit. Because if you pull too tight, you could end up messing the fabric up. You could pull the stitches previous too tightly, and you don't want to do that. Now with double running and single running stitches, there are a lot of methods that you can use these stitches for. While I'm giving you guys a chance to kind of finish up yours, I'll show you a couple examples. So for this piece here, and you can use stem stitching as well, which is a stitch that we'll go over as well today, but for me, I like using the double running as an outline. It helps, especially keeping it on a thinner side for your outlines when you want to do more detail work. I know a lot of people use stem stitch if they want a bolder outline, which you can also still do double running stitches as outlines and do thicker in this particular situation, if you can see here, I used a thicker number of threads. So instead of 2 threads, I would usually go up to 3 or 4 threads if I want a thicker outline using a double running stitch for an outline.
Do you normally do your outline first, or do you do it after the rest is stitched and then you do the outline over top of it?
So for me, I will usually do an outline after I've done the inner portion of the piece, just because a lot of times when you're doing the inner portion and you do the outline first, you might accidentally go over your outline with your other stitches. So
Right.
having the outline second will be easier for you to keep it more clean.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that
So
makes sense.
I learned that pretty well here. As you can see, some portions of my outline on the top of the head, because I decided to do chain stitch instead of regular satin stitching, it got covered up. So that's why doing the outline after you do most of your background and your main portion is probably better so that you can have more of a pop. So with ending a line or ending a stitch, most of the time, some people will just let the thread go, but we have a lot of thread here. So what you can do, what I do, and it typically helps keeping things clean, is I'll pull my needle under the stitch, and I might even follow the entire thing back up to the beginning, to where I ended it here. So, and this is the back side. So I will kind of weave it through previous stitches to help lock it in place in case something were to happen with my thread anywhere in between. Then I know that the rest of it should stay in place because I've locked it down. We're just going to go back to the top here. If your line is longer, like I had made mine, or you can extend off of this line, that's fine as well. But we're going to go into another stitch called the split stitch, which is why we did 2 threads for our beginning portion. So on the back here, you should thread it through. It'll make it look a little thicker on the back end, but it helps keep it more flat than trying to tie a knot in the back.
What time period and when, excuse me, what time period and what region was the split stitch first used at?
With the running and double running stitch, it was brought into use around the 4th century. And it was Byzantine and Coptic.
Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it was brought into play during the 4th century, but it was continued to be used throughout the time, which is how we know about it today. But it's a very basic and very easy stitch, which is honestly, in my opinion, why they came out with it, was because then they could decorate things. And then a lot of time with the because back then they mostly did decorations of like birds, or they would do human figures. So they use this stitch to help with outlines or just initial decorations. Like so for running stitch, you don't have to finish it out with a double running. You could actually line up a bunch of running stitches together and kind of make it basically fill out a pattern with spaces in between wherever you're doing it. So it doesn't have to just finish out with a double running stitch. And I can show you examples of that as well. So what we're going to do is begin this split stitch. So what you'll do here, because I weaved my thread through the back of my running and double running stitches, I'm just going to stick the needle through the beginning here so that we're kind of facing the straight line. So in this particular situation, just to teach how the split stitch works, because as you get more experienced with your stitches, you'll be able to make them smaller. But we'll go ahead and do a 1/4 inch stitch again. And instead of pulling it all the way through, you're going to leave a little bit there. So as you can see here, I left a little bit of a gap there. So it's like a little loop on top of the fabric. And this is going to help you with splitting the stitch, which basically means you're going to split the threads evenly. And what we'll do here is about middle ground, middle of the stitch. You'll stick your needle through, and you'll want to make sure that your needle goes through your 2 threads. Can everybody see that okay? So I went about halfway mark on the stitch I had previously put down and left up a little bit. And I stuck the needle through the halfway mark and through the 2 threads on that stitch. And then to continue it, what you'll do is you'll go about 1/4 of an inch from the point that you created, that you went through that previous stitch. You'll go 1/4 inch. And now since you have your first stitch down, it makes it easier for you to find the middle ground. So you'll stick your needle through. And then what I like to do sometimes, depending on what I'm working on, is I'll actually help the thread out a little bit, and I'll kind of split it up myself. That would be my cat again. She feels very lonely because I'm on here. So I went ahead and split it up myself, and then I'll stick the needle through the 2 threads. And again, you never want to pull overly taut, because then you'll end up making it too tight. You'll mess the fabric up. You could end up pulling threads within the fabric that you're embroidering into apart, and that'll leave a big old gap in everything. And what I'll do is I'll just throw down a few here. Now, depending on how long you made your thread, so you see here my thread is starting to get a little short. What I'll do at this point, after I put down another one, is I'm going to go ahead and finish out this thread. To finish a split stitch, usually the easiest thing to do is you just end it at the last end of the last stitch you put down. Or I know some people will just leave it like that and kind of fit through slightly next to the middle stitch in between the threads, and they'll put it down there. I like to end it at the end. Everybody has their own preference when they get started. And the reason I had you started off the running stitch is because then you can see how it makes it a little thicker. Your solid line is now a little bit thicker than what your running and double running are. So I'm going to finish this thread out because I want to make sure I have enough thread to do the next thing here. And so as I was saying, a lot of people will just leave it stranded. I went ahead and weaved through a couple of the stitches, and I'm leaving it undone here. When you're doing a massive piece, these little strands you can actually kind of incorporate other stitches to help hold them down by putting stitches on top of them. And I'll show you an example of teeny tiny split stitch, as I've been doing split stitch for a little while. But the lion's arm, not the fur off of his arm, but the lion's arm is full of teeny tiny split stitches. And I did it that way to make it look like fur. So you can use split stitch to help with adding texture on things like fur, or in this case for the bird, kind of gave it texture to look kind of like wings or feathers, or you know, just kind of lined it with those stitches. So everybody can you tell that those are split stitches? Because once you get a lot of split stitches together, they don't look like it unless you actually like really looking close. See here. Yeah, the rest of these are the other stitches. Here, this might be a better opportunity. These are larger split stitches here. So you can use split stitch to add texture. You can also use the split stitches as a fill-in. I know a lot of people use split stitch as a fill-in for larger pieces. So this is a bunch of split stitch lines together. Okay, I'm gonna get my needle threaded here. We'll move on to the next section, which is one of my personal favorites. I rather enjoy using it as a filler as well as just decorative or outlines or anything. And we're gonna use 2 for this as well, just to keep it consistent for those of you that are still on your same thread. Those of you that have moved on, you're welcome to up it to 3 if you'd like. But we can keep it at 2 just for sake of learning the techniques. And I will say split stitch is not 8th century, it is 10th century. But these are all basic stitches that we're learning here so that we can understand kind of what we're looking at when we see people with their fancy garb and they've got all sorts of embroidery on it. Now you can actually identify the different stitches that are on there, and you can also apply them yourself. 10th century to 11th century is when the chain and split stitch came out, which is the 2 stitches, the stitch that we just learned, which is the split stitch, and then the next one that we're going to learn is the chain stitch. Are there any questions on the split stitch before I move on? Okay, perfect. So the next stitch is called the chain stitch, and it'll look very similar to a chain. And I'll show you an example of it after we put a few stitches down. I'm going to use my marking tool again, and I'm going to do a new line. And this time, instead of a full-on straight line, I'm actually going to go ahead and give it a curve at the end here, and maybe a little swirly. Because chain stitch, you can actually follow not just straight lines, but you can do curved lines or circles or anything like that, which is how I like to do it. And then just as before, put your needle through at the beginning of your line, and then you'll flip it around to anchor it at the back with your finger. I'll give everybody a few minutes to get to that point, or a couple seconds here. Now, I have seen chain stitch done 2 ways. I'm going to show you the way I do it. In my opinion, it's a faster way of doing it. Other people do it backwards, which I have a hard time figuring out myself. But those others who do it the different way, I'm sure would be more than happy to show you how they do it. But in a chain stitch, what you're going to do is you're going to create a loop by going back on the same stitch you came through your fabric with. So you stick your needle back through the same point that you brought your fabric up, but you're not going to pull it all the way through. You're going to leave a big, large loop. Now, as you can see, this twisted, which means my thread was twisted. And to fix that, depending on how large you want to make your stitch in this situation, to learn the technique, we're going to do a 1/4 inch. Basically, you want it to be flat and open. So I twisted, I'll let it twist up again. I took the tip of my needle and I twisted it in the opposite direction that the thread was twisting to untwist it. Once you're at this point, you can pull your needle through, let the loop come down on top of that section there, and you'll create a tiny little loop. Looks like a teardrop. It's my favorite too. I literally use it for everything. I use it as a fill-in, I use it as a decorative portion, I use it as a chain. It's one of my favorite stitches. So with the chain stitch, we created that loop, but we want to kind of bring it up a little bit. I'm going to bring it up a little bit here so you can see that I'm going to do the same thing I did before, except now it's looped through that tiny little loop. I'm going to do the same thing I did with the first loop, and I'm going to stick this needle through the point the thread comes up. And I'm going to pull it just enough so that there's still extra there. And we'll go up about a 1/4 inch. And we'll, through the second loop, now that the first loop, I'll pull this loop here to flatten out the first loop there so there's no confusion. You're going to put the needle through the second loop and bring it down. So now you can see we've begun a chain. Do we have any questions so far? So while everybody's practicing that, I'm going to go ahead and throw down until I get to my first point of curving, and then I'll show you kind of some tricks with that. And don't get frustrated if you can't get your needle in the exact spot that your line is at right away. If this is your first time embroidering, it takes a lot of practice to get used to how the needle's going to come up through your fabric, especially if you're not using kind of see-through fabric like I am. Especially if you're going to end up using, any kind of fabric that is darker, dark blue, blacks, anything that's white and a thicker fabric. Don't get frustrated. It takes a lot of practice to get your needle to come up exactly where you want it. And even I don't get it to come up exactly where I want it every time. So I'll give it a few seconds here while I grab a sip of water. Did everybody draw like a kind of curved line? I'm gonna assume so with people. So, I need the light here. As you can see, I've got kind of a squiggly line going on here. And the cool thing with chain stitch is it's not going to look perfect, but it's going to look cool. All right, so for me with doing curves, I like to try to make, so before we were making them 1/4 inch loops, I like to try and make them a little bit smaller to start a curve. So I'll make it maybe like 1/8 of an inch large and start there. So as you see, it can get a little wonky. It's starting to pull it. So that tells me that I didn't twist it the right direction. So before I had you untwist it if it got twisted up. In a situation where you're following a curve, sometimes it's best to switch which way it's twisting. So right now it's supposed to be flat. It's supposed to be flat. There you go. So that's what it would look like if it was just coming out normal in this situation, because if I were to do it the normal way, it's going to pull it in a funky direction. And I don't want it to pull it that way. I want it to actually lay it flat so that you can see that chain. So what I would do is I would twist it the opposite direction, or my thread will decide to tangle up on itself, which is things that you can encounter with this. One, two. So instead of going through this way, through the loop this way, I may end up going through the loop the other direction so that it twists it in a different direction and makes it more flat. So now you can see, instead of pulling the thread that way, it's now laying it flat on my fabric. Do I need to repeat that step for anyone? Is it Genevieve or Genevieve?
Genevieve.
Genevieve, excellent. I see you're working on your thread there. I'll go ahead and
Yeah, I
had
to rethread. I ran out of thread.
I'll go ahead and repeat it for those that asked for repeats, and for Genevieve there who's rethreading her needle. And anytime that you lose, actually this will be a great time. Anytime you lose a hoop and that hoop's gone, dang it, I can't finish it up. No, you can. What you do is you just gently pull on the previous hoop, just gently work it, and my hoop has been created again. For anybody that lost the hoop. Okay, so then, as I was saying before, in normal, creating your things, you want your strings to be flat. My string likes to twist up, and you'll get that a lot. You want your strings to be flat, and typically we'll go through the hoop this way. If we're going a straight line, we just want to go through it the same way we've been, but with a curve, once it's flat, you actually want to go, and I'll turn my thing here to help with the direction. You want to go the opposite direction through that hoop. You want to go backwards, basically. Just through the hoop back. And then once you pull that through, it'll twist it so that it lays it flat instead of twisting it and pulling your thread in a funky direction. I'll go ahead and bring it back around. Because once you get to that point and you've got your first curve, your first hard angle taken care of, you can continue through kind of normal. In situations where there's a softer curve, I will usually just make it like 1/8 of an inch loop or smaller depending on what I'm actually working on. If I'm detailing something like vines, or I'm just doing an outline, or I'm just filling in, I'll usually do between 1/4 and 1/8 of an inch along a curved line. Once you get that first hard angle done though, as I said, it's pretty simple from there. You just follow along the line and you can do it the normal way from that point. Because the biggest thing about it is you want to make sure that you're laying it flat, but once you get that hard line done, you can go through, I'm going to stay at my 1/8 of an inch here. You can go through the thread at a normal direction. So now we've got it laying flat again. And it's going to stay that way as I work through. And if you go through on harder angles, you can shorten up the chain to kind of help with the curving, to keep it flat on the curve. But you'll just follow along. You'll just follow it along. And as you can see there, my chain has stayed pretty flat. Thankfully, my thread's working with me again. And again, do not fret. Your thread will have a mind of its own sometimes. So as everybody's working on that, I'm going to show you a few examples of how I use chain stitch. So as you can see here, this is chain stitch on the outside of that bird. This is all chain stitch. Looks kind of viney because I threw it all together and rather close together. I also did something that not a lot of people will do, and I reversed the direction of my chain stitch when I threw it all together. So the technique's the same. The only thing that's different is which direction you go will change where your loops sit. And let me see if I can do this. Because this is chalk, this makes it easier for getting rid of later. So these ones go in this direction here. These ones all follow this direction. But these ones down here in the center, these ones are actually going up. So they end up hiding inside the other stitches and making it thicker there because they're going the opposite direction, which means you're getting chain stitch overlap. So I'll shine a light on that again. So the outside is going one direction and some of the inside is going the opposite direction, which helped thicken up the background of this piece. And then I used chain stitch. I only used 3 layers thick on this piece to do the thick outline of the piece as a whole. So I used chain stitch on this, all going the same direction, to help with outlining the baronial Baron and Baroness badge, which is the flaming laurel wreath. So I used it for that. And again, you can use it for other things. It could be straight lines like we did here on our practice. It could be a single curved line. You can use it if you're making a piece that has people on it and they have chains. You can use it to make their chains instead of stitching color inside the entire piece. You can put it on top of other sections. It doesn't have to be like this. If I had filled this whole thing in with white, and then I could still throw a chain stitch on top of that to help with giving it that look. But it's really, play with it, you know, find different designs, test out different ways that you're filling in pieces or outlining pieces. Now, for those of you that are ready to finish your stitch, much like I was showing before, if I were to just pull it through, your stitch is finished. You can thread the back of it to help with keeping your thread down. But instead of creating a loop for the next piece, you would just put it through where you brought your thread up through a hoop. You go around the end of the hoop and kind of lock it down. I'll show that again. Okay, I'm gonna get it through here. So my thread is through the hoop, as we all see. And then instead of creating a new hoop, I'm just going back down where I brought the thread through the hoop and locking it down. Now, as you can see, you have to be careful not to pull too hard. I just pulled the tip of my hoop through. It's an easy enough fix. You can take your needle, kind of gently pull it through again, and just gently pull your thread. This is another example of why you should not pull your thread too hard. You pull the thread too hard, you lose a chain. I'll show you examples of long short because those are pretty simple. You don't really need to see that done. It's very similar to doing running and double running. The only thing that is a little different is, as you can see here, it creates kind of a block patterning. This is my run on the long shorts in terms of just doing standard. And then I have the around the flaming laurel wreaths. It's a bunch of long shorts kind of mixed together to give it more texture, make it look more like fire. Or you can make it look like a lion's mane or the tufts of fur on the end of his arm. So that's different ways you can use the long short. The only one that I really should show you guys is going to be the stem stitch. And my handout has a couple other ones, but they're pretty straightforward, and I try my best to describe them really well inside of the item. So to do this, you can just use the same thread you were using before. I'm gonna have to rethread mine real quick. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna use the same line that I created for the chain stitch, because stem stitch is best for curved lines. It is great for outlining. So I'm gonna go ahead and do the same thing. I'm gonna anchor it down with my finger. And with stem stitch, you're going to be kind of giving it an angle. And what you'll usually do is you'll start out kind of like a running stitch, and similarly to a split stitch, but not splitting the threads, you're gonna go like halfway, at a halfway mark next to the the stitch that you just put down, and then you're going to try to keep the same length. You're basically wrapping the line you created with an angled stitch. It's probably the best way I can explain it. So I'm always going halfway marker on the previous stitch, but I'm not going through the threads, I'm going next to the threads. And when you're doing curves, it's always best to go to the inside of the curve with your stitch. And as you can see, it looks kind of jagged. I'm gonna get the light here. Looks a little jagged. And you can clean it up by making your stitches a little closer together. But you would follow this, and once you get to the next curved point, you would change where you're putting. Instead of going on the inside of this curve, as you go straight down, you would be going to the inside of the next curve. So you're always, when you're doing curves, you want to try and follow the inside of the curve. wherever you're throwing your stitch down. And I'll show you, does anybody have questions on the stem stitch? Okay, I'll show you Satin Stitch, which is also in the handout for those that want a handout. Satin Stitch is basically a fill-in stitch for small areas. You never want to do super large areas because you'll lose detail. But as you can see there, I filled in the leaf, which is most common for satin stitches, is leaves or gems, anything that's small, round, spherical shaped, oval shaped, things of that nature. You can use it to fill in leaves to help add a leaf look to it, or use it to fill in gems to add shiny components. And then couching, actually we can use this to show the same thing. It's hard to tell here because it's the same color, but the stems that I used, or the stems I created, I couched. And couching is basically putting down a thicker piece of thread, and then you're basically wrapping it with another thread that's on your needle. So we'll use this as a quick demonstration. I always like to go back through the point which I brought the thread up. And as you can see there, it is now couched. And you'll go up like every little bit, and you'll throw another stitch down on top. And you can use couching to help with fill-in as well. You can also use it as kind of, if anybody's a scribe here, you can use it as kind of a background decorative for any sort of scenes that have people in it or animals or anything like that, which they call diapering. So you can make it look very similar to diapering on your embroidery pieces as well. With that, I know there's a minute left. Everybody that has sent an email in the chat, I will definitely get you a handout. I'll also get you another source piece of material if you want to go more advanced than the basic stitches. And I hope everybody learned something today. My name is Lady Ceridwen. Thanks for stopping by.